In domestic violence cases, we don't think of courthouses or legal proceedings as being abusive or traumatic. For victims of abuse, they can cause extreme distress. And for the abusers, they're another opportunity to further harm their victim in plain sight, and it is not recognized by society. And if you haven't listened to it, in my first video called What We Get Wrong About Domestic Violence, Abuse is a Pattern, Not an Incident, I cover some of the impact of emotional abuse on victims, why it's so harmful, and how emotional abuse is the most common and most destructive part of domestic violence. But what I'm covering here is how that abuse is continued in the courtroom. And while this is not exclusive to domestic violence, I'll be focusing on some of those things that we see with domestic violence. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just a quick overview of some of the biggest things we're missing where the victims are, again, being harmed right in front of us and we don't see it. And we can start with the fact that the victim may have to be in the same courtroom with the very person who battered them, nearly killed them, drugged them, raped them, harmed their children, or any other types of abuse as a part of the legal process. And then be questioned about whether they're really in danger, whether they were really hurt, have their credibility questioned, all while their abuser watches them. And very often there's also a protection order against the abuser in consequence of the domestic violence. Court hearings provide an opportunity for abusers, otherwise prevented from getting close to their victim, to do so. Outside the courthouse, abusers may watch to see what type of vehicle the victim shows up in, or who their new relationship is, or gather any information they can use to stalk or harass the victim, and they may follow the victim in their vehicle after court as a replay of other times they may have followed or chased them, while working to intimidate others who might be there to support the victim, or even disrupt their new relationships, or further undermine their sense of safety. As a preventive measure, it may be helpful to find alternative transportation to the court, or be dropped off and picked up right at the front door of the courthouse to minimize encounters that take place or could take place out of view of security on the premises. Inside the courthouse, a legal hearing can provide an opportunity for the abuser to intimidate the victim by walking up close to them in the courthouse, just happening to pass by, or to glare at them, make loud disparaging comments to be overheard by the victim in passing by, or any other number of threatening behaviors, all designed to cause further emotional distress and trauma. And all of this combines to send the message that the victim is not safe anywhere, even in a courthouse with marshals, bailiffs, police, and security around. And as unfortunately, security is often busy and does not know every single protection order or the identity of everyone who has one. It may not have been granted yet, and this makes it easy for abusers to approach victims in the busyness of the courthouse and carry out these types of abuse. And one way to mitigate this is by the victim being physically surrounded by any supporters, watching to involve law enforcement that's present if needs be. Victims can also sit outside the main traffic areas and travel paths that the abuser may use during the court hearing to minimize contact. And they can also station themselves near any security who may be present on the floor. But inside the courtroom, intimidation may continue, often continues, as abusers stare or glare at the victim as they have in the past just before they attack the victim. And they may scoff while the victim's speaking to further work to undermine their confidence. Meanwhile, former friends or even family may side with the abuser in court or testify against the victim, creating a further sense of isolation for the victim. Their children may be present, watching their efforts to care for them be attacked and degraded, and the children become status symbols in the proceedings, objects to be won, taken from, and turned against the victim. Abusers will often use phrases and personal experiences they know will trigger an emotional response from the victim. I've seen cases where the abuser was able to provoke the victim to react emotionally in the courtroom, and then the victim was threatened with arrest, fines, and other sanctions by the judge. Again, sending the message that the world does not care about them, the victim is the problem, and the abuser can get away with anything, and the victim will pay for it. Thankfully, I did see some judges who recognized when these types of manipulations were being used, and they ordered the abuser to only look at the front of the courtroom, directed all commentary and questions to the judge. They were required to sit still and not allowed to make any gestures, including head shaking, while the victim was speaking, with a threat of being charged with contempt if they violated those instructions. And some would even require the abuser to remain for an additional 15 minutes while the victim was escorted by security or family to their vehicle and safely able to leave the courthouse. And I would love to see those expectations of conduct used more regularly in the courtroom to prevent abusers from using the process to further harm the victim. Meanwhile, the victim's often experiencing sleeplessness due to extremely high stress and trauma. They may be facing eviction or homelessness with children, losing children, being retaliated against if they do not win in court, or any other number of negative consequences, combining to impact their ability to function, impacting their memory, their ability to keep a job, their ability to care for children, their ability to take steps to protect themselves. And the abusers will often portray the stressed out and traumatized victim now as an unfit parent, having unreliable testimony who doesn't really care and isn't really trying, yet they're the one who stressed the victim out, traumatized them, impairing their abilities in the first place. And the nature of the legal system requires testimony to be questioned, memories to be questioned, evidence to be examined. Very intimate personal questions may have to be asked of the victim. Personal stories disclosed in court, photographs of injuries to private parts of their body may be included in evidence and reviewed in court. The victim is required to relive the experience all over again while being questioned and even discredited or feeling faulted for trying to protect themselves. And in the cases where the victim loses, the loss is just another message to the victim: you can't win. Nobody cares. Stop trying. And they are often literally faced with the reality of deciding whether or not to give up on life. In some cases, the government takes up prosecution of the abuse on the basis that there was a crime, regardless of the victim's wishes. This is the case in Idaho with domestic violence. But very often, the victim may actually wish to defend their abuser for any number of reasons. Fear of future retaliation from the abuser, loss of income, loss of children. They may have been convinced their abuser's arrest and subsequent court hearing and any ensuing negative consequences are their fault, or any other number of reasons. Justice may be served with a guilty verdict, and yet the victim still loses. Meanwhile, continuations, extensions, or further hearings require the victim to take more time off work, lose more money, pay for childcare, more gas, and such, all further deplete already drained emotional and physical resources of the victim. And they may be granted their requested protection order, but have it expire in a number of months so that they have to repeat the process again to have it continued. The result is that they don't get to truly be free of their abuser because they keep having to face them in court. Or the victim's then eyeing the calendar, waiting to be stalked or threatened on the day the protection order expires, which, given the history of abuse and trauma, is a very valid and even real fear, and it has and does happen. And again, when they lose and aren't given their protection order, the message that they receive and get is that, again, nobody cares, you're not safe, nobody will protect you, and the result is hopelessness, despair, more trauma, wondering or watching to be threatened, harassed, and stalked, again, which does happen. And in other cases, a protection order instated by the government for the victim's safety becomes an obstacle to the victim managing finances, childcare, transportation, business, employment, all the things that can be tied up in a relationship. And now their safety, literally, becomes an obstacle to their ability to care for themselves. It's kind of a catch-22. And victims may not be able to afford an attorney. Abusers may have restricted their access to finances or have kept the victim dependent on them financially for any number of reasons, prevented them from working or pursuing their education such that when the victim needs to take legal action to protect themselves, they are very unable to do so. And yet, they may be facing an abuser who has money and an attorney, such that the victim does not truly have a level playing field to keep themselves safe. A continuation of all they've experienced in the abusive relationship, only now it's happening in court. I watched one attorney station themselves in the courthouse after the hearing, so that the victim had to pass by them on the way out. And they were glaring at the victim and saying really loudly to the abuser, "We're going to get her. We're going to make her pay," basically taking over the abuse of the victim for the abuser. But it was a case of more threats, more intimidation, more fear, more exhaustion. And even though the victim won in that case, the win didn't stop the other attorney from dragging them back into the court for more trauma, more abuse, more stress, more drains on finances. And even when the victim wins, the abuse is often not over. Thank you for listening. There is a lot more that can be said on this, but this is just a brief overview to help people recognize another way the abusive victim is hidden in plain sight in our society, how we miss it and consider it normal. And we need to recognize that domestic violence goes far beyond the violent act. And again, abuse is a pattern, not an incident, and it extends well outside the home, but throughout society and even into our institutions that are supposed to protect and help the victims. So if you want to help, like, share, comment, and subscribe. I've got more videos coming out. Please share this and see the others. But for us to stop domestic violence, we really need to start changing how we look at it and seeing what we miss. So thank you for listening, and please share.